He vanished in the heart of a blizzard in Alberta. No one knew why he left the cabin, and no one believed he could survive. But 4 days later, they found him alive, curled beside a creature no one could explain. A husky or something else, something not of this world. The boy never spoke, but his eyes and the drawings he kept making over and over of glowing golden eyes burning like fire told a story science couldn't explain. This isn't just a survival story. This is a story about a bond that defies logic, a silent connection between human and nature, something that may stretch beyond the borders of our known world. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button now to experience more powerful and emotional storytelling films from us. Snow was already falling when the wind changed. Thin, dry flakes spiraled through the air like ash from a distant fire, and the sky above Alberta thickened with a storm, not yet born but already breathing. The trees' miles of towering pine-black sentinels groaned under the shifting weight of the air as if they sensed what was coming. A storm was brewing. A storm that would test more than just the limits of survival. It would test the bonds between blood, the meaning of loyalty, and the mysterious fragile thread that connects the soul of a child to something ancient and unseen. The land around the mountain cabin lay in perfect stillness, like a painting suspended between inhale and exhale. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of quiet that made even the birds hold their songs. Somewhere deeper in the forest, a branch snapped under the weight of fresh snow. Then nothing. Just the wind brushing the trees with the whisper of something it hadn't yet said. Inside the cabin, a fire crackled. But it didn't chase away the chill that had settled over the wooden floorboards and the hearts of the people who lived there. Caleb sat cross-legged by the window, a worn sketchbook balanced on his lap, a dull pencil clutched in his small hand. His eyes, gray like a lake in winter, were locked on the landscape outside. He didn't blink much. He didn't speak. Not unless he wanted to. And he almost never wanted to. 7 years old. Diagnosed with autism at 3. Nonverbal mostly. Not because he didn't understand, but because the world to Caleb often spoke a language not worth answering. He liked stillness. He liked symmetry. He liked patterns in the snow, the perfect rhythm of animal tracks left in the frost. The way trees leaned slightly in the direction the wind had come from, like they were listening to the past. Today his pencil traced a curve, a paw print, a large one. Not like a coyote or fox. Something bigger. He had seen it outside the woodshed that morning. No one else had noticed. But he had. It was the first thing his eyes found, as always. From the kitchen, his mother's voice floated in a soft hum, a tune that had no words. She always hummed when she was anxious. Today she'd been humming since dawn. She moved like someone holding her breath. Her eyes, dark and tired, flicked constantly from the weather app on her phone to the old radio, then back to the window. A blizzard warning had been issued. Worst since '97, the man on the radio had said. Roads would be closed. Electricity could go. Temperatures could drop to -30 or below. If you're not inside, you shouldn't be. But what scared her most wasn't the storm. It was Caleb. He was unpredictable in the way weather could be. Quiet, calm, and then suddenly gone. Not dangerous. Just determined. Drawn to things no one else saw. He once followed a moth for nearly a mile into the woods behind the cabin. Another time they found him kneeling beside a frozen creek, watching water spiders weave paths across the ice, utterly unaware that his hands had turned blue. And now there were fresh animal tracks near the house. She hadn't told her husband. He wouldn't understand. Caleb's father was the kind of man who fixed problems with hammers and long silences. He loved his son, but he feared him too in a quiet, shameful way that he tried to drink away at night. Caleb's world was different. Not wrong, just separate. And sometimes it was hard to reach across that invisible river that ran between their minds. His mother knew that. She had been trying to build a bridge since the day he was born. The boy didn't flinch as the wind howled outside. He didn't even notice the firewood creaking in the hearth or the kettle whistling too loud on the stove. His hand moved across the paper with a rhythm only he could hear. 1 paw. 2. A set of tracks winding into whiteness. His mother approached quietly, kneeling beside him. "What's that?" she asked gently, knowing he wouldn't answer. but sometimes, rarely, he'd tilt the sketchbook just enough for her to see. This time he did. The drawing was strange. Not just the paw prints, they were oversized and precise, but at the end of the trail, he had drawn a shape. A figure. Not human. 4 legs, a tail, and eyes. The eyes were the most haunting part. Large, almond-shaped, colored in, with the yellow-orange of the only crayon he ever used anymore. That crayon had been worn down to a nub. Every dog Caleb had drawn in the last 2 months had eyes like that. Not brown, not blue, gold. Bright, intelligent, almost human. "Is that your friend?" she whispered, brushing a lock of hair from his temple. He didn't nod. He didn't move. But she saw something flicker across his face. Not emotion. Caleb's expressions were too subtle for that. More like memory. He had seen that creature. Somewhere. And he'd followed it. Behind her, the wind banged the shutters. Storms rolling in, her husband muttered, stomping snow off his boots as he came inside. He looked over at his son and the sketchbook. His jaw tightened. "Still drawing those damn dogs," he said, not cruelly, but tired. She gave him a look, one that said, "Not now." Caleb's pencil stilled. His eyes blinked once. Slowly. Outside, snow began to fall harder, covering the older prints, erasing the forest's memory. But Caleb remembered. He always remembered. That night, while the wind clawed at the cabin walls and trees swayed like frightened sentinels, Caleb lay awake in bed, eyes wide open. The drawing was under his pillow. He could still see the paw prints. Not the ones he drew, the real ones. The ones leading into the trees. They had been fresh. And they hadn't ended. They had gone on. Beyond the shed. Beyond the edge of the forest line. Out where the trees were thickest. Out where no one else dared to walk. The creature had passed by the house just before dawn. He hadn't seen it. But he'd heard it. Not a growl, not a bark. Just breathing. Steady. Close. Like something watching him through the window, waiting. Not a monster, not a threat. Something else. Something that understood. His mother, sleeping beside him in the same room, turned once and whispered his name in her sleep. But he didn't respond. His eyes were on the window. There, just beyond the frost-glazed glass, something moved. Just for a second, a shape slender, tall for a dog, almost spectral, stood at the tree line, its eyes glowing like candlelight in the dark. Caleb didn't scream. He didn't run. He just watched. And the figure, impossibly still against the wind, seemed to watch him back. Then it vanished into the storm. When he woke the next morning, there were no prints, no tracks. The snow had covered everything, except what was in his mind. His mother found him standing by the door, dressed in his coat and boots scarf, wrapped in a crooked knot the way only he would tie it. His hand clutched the drawing. She knelt down fast, heart pounding. "Caleb, where are you going?" No answer, just a look, eyes steady, focused. And then he pointed, toward the woods. She followed his gaze and saw nothing. Just the trees, the snow, the endless white. But Caleb saw more. He always saw more. That was the last time anyone saw Caleb James, before the blizzard swallowed Alberta whole. And somewhere beneath the falling sky, a boy with a mind made of silence followed footprints no one else could see. And something waited for him, something with golden eyes. It began with silence, the kind of silence that comes before something breaks. Before the air splits open, before time begins to tremble at its edges. The light that morning was a dull blue filtered through heavy clouds and snow that had begun to fall in slow, steady waves. It wasn't yet a storm, but it was no longer peace either. It was something in between. Something watching. Waiting. Caleb stood by the woodshed again. He had slipped out before either parent was awake, his boots crunching softly across the crust of early snow. The sky above was pale and bruised the color of a fresh wound. The trees no longer looked like sentinels. They looked like giants waiting to exhale. And there they were, paw prints, large, impossibly large, sunk deep into the snow like they belonged to something too heavy to move so lightly. They circled the shed once, then curved toward the tree line. He stood motionless, heart ticking like the second hand of an old clock. His breath fogged in the cold. Then slowly he stepped forward, 1 foot, then another. He didn't run. Caleb never ran. He followed. The prints were strange, too symmetrical, too even. As if whatever made them had walked not through the snow, but through the memory of snow. There were no drag marks, no mess, just clean, sharp imprints that cut through the white like slices in paper. Back inside the cabin, his mother stirred. She reached out, eyes still closed instinctively, searching for the warmth of her son's body. Her hand touched only the rumpled quilt. She sat up instantly. "Caleb." No answer. She was out of bed in a breath, already moving. The door to the small bedroom was cracked open. His coat was gone. The boots were missing from the mat. Her stomach dropped. Her chest tightened. The humming in her head, the one she always heard when she was afraid, started to rise. "Caleb." She burst onto the porch, barefoot, skin already burning from the cold. The snow was falling harder now. Not gentle, heavy, sharp-edged. The kind that stings your cheeks like slap after slap. Her eyes scanned the yard, then the tree line. Nothing. "Caleb." She ran inside. Her husband was at the stove, coffee in hand, bleary-eyed. "He's gone," she gasped. "He's not in the house. His coat's gone. Boots are gone." That was all it took. The cup shattered on the floor. Outside, the prints were still visible, but barely, already softening under the thickening snow. The storm hadn't arrived in full, but it was moving faster now, bearing down on them like something with teeth. The father grabbed his parka-pulled boots over bare feet and ran. The mother behind him, eyes wide with panic, her voice breaking as she called her son's name into the trees. The wind didn't answer. Only the forest did by saying nothing at all. They found the prints near the woodshed, just like Caleb had. The father followed them, his legs pushing through knee-deep powder lungs, burning with cold and fear. But the tracks were fading. Already the snow was reclaiming them, erasing Caleb's path like he'd never existed. They followed them for 30 yards, 40. Then they vanished completely beneath a new sheet of white. He stopped, turned in circles. "Caleb." His voice cracked. Not from cold, but from something older. A fear rooted in helplessness, in guilt, in love too big to protect. Behind him, his wife collapsed to her knees, fists in the snow, rocking forward and back. "He wouldn't go far," she sobbed. "He wouldn't." But he had. He had followed something into the woods, and now he was gone. By 9:30 a.m., the local sheriff's department was alerted. By 10:15, the first snowplow couldn't make it up the road. By 10:45, the first whiteout hit. Visibility dropped to less than 15 feet. The storm had arrived. Inside the cabin, maps were spread out. Radios crackled. Rescue volunteers came snow-covered and solemn. They brought dogs, but the wind was too strong, their noses failed them. The scent trails were shredded, scattered like leaves in a hurricane. "We're running out of time," one officer muttered. His mother sat wrapped in a blanket, a thermos untouched in her hands, her face vacant. Her eyes were fixed on the sketch Caleb had left behind. The one with the golden eyes. "Does he know the woods well?" a search leader asked. "He doesn't know danger," she replied. "He doesn't know cold. He doesn't know to come back." The storm raged louder. Branches cracked like bones under the weight of ice. Trees groaned. The wind screamed down the canyons between hills, like a voice too large for words. They searched anyway. 10-20 men fanned out with GPS trackers and flares, moving through thigh-deep snow, calling his name until their throats bled from the cold. Caleb heard none of it. He was already too far, far from the sound of sirens, far from the warmth of fires, far from everything but the thing that had called to him, the tracks in the snow, the shape in the trees, the feeling that he was meant to go. Not foolishly, not blindly, but with a purpose he couldn't explain. He walked until his legs stopped aching, until he forgot time, until even the cold became something background. A rhythm, a weight, a hum inside his bones, a hum. Behind him the storm erased every step. The world closed its mouth and swallowed him whole. Back at the cabin, his father stood on the porch long after night fell. The snow was endless now. The wind had turned violent. He stared into it. Eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched, the flashlight in his hand, long since dead. "He's not just out there," he said. "He's gone." "No," his wife whispered. "He's with something." He followed it. He looked at her, not confusion, not anger, but fear. "What the hell does that mean?" She didn't answer. She held the sketch, and in it the eyes glowed gold, even in the dark. By first light the next morning, the storm had eased just enough to allow vehicles to crawl up the mountain roads. Snowdrifts stood taller than a man's waist, and branches had splintered under the weight of ice. Alberta's trees bore the scars of the storm like war-wounded soldiers. But it wasn't the destruction that brought the police. It was the silence. The unbearable, bone-deep silence of a child gone missing in the snow. Sheriff Donnie McCrae had seen things in his 30 years on the force. Avalanches, wolf attacks, lost hikers who never came back. But nothing rattled him like a missing child, especially not one like Caleb James. A boy who didn't cry for help, who wouldn't respond to shouting, who could be 10 feet from you and still vanish into himself. The first search teams arrived just before 8 a.m. Emergency responders' dog units, a half-dozen volunteers from nearby hamlets who didn't wait to be asked. They came with shovels, flares, thermals, and hope that was already starting to wear thin. The parents' cabin became command central. Radios buzzed. Maps were pinned to corkboard walls. Circles were drawn in red ink. The forest, already endless now, became a maze of possibility and threat. "He could have gone anywhere," said the deputy, pulling off a wet glove to rub his face. "No," said the mother. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut the room clean in half. He followed something. The room paused. She stepped forward, still holding the sketch, Caleb's last drawing. The golden eyes seemed to glow against the white paper. He doesn't wonder. He follows. No one laughed. No one dared. She looked like someone whose soul had already cracked and was now running on something else, entirely pure, blinding need. Donnie McCrae took the sketch gently. "Ma'am, we'll cover every inch." She didn't blink. Then look where he was looking. Follow what he saw. The first sweep began at 8:45. Teams of 2 grid patterns sweeping from the tree line out. It was methodical, professional, slow, too slow. Every step was a fight against snow that swallowed ankles, knees, sometimes thighs. Trees loomed like watchers, and the wind, though weakened, still howled through the branches with a voice too close to a child's cry. By noon, the search had expanded 2 miles in each direction. No sign. Not a single footprint. No scarf dropped. No sign of panic or resistance. Just gone. The snow had erased everything. But then came the dogs. 6 German shepherds flown in with handlers from Calgary, trained for disaster zones, bomb detection, cadaver retrieval. They sniffed Caleb's jacket, his pillow, even the crayon he used to draw the creature with gold eyes. Then they were loosed, and they stopped. Just stopped. 3 of them barked once, then circled. 2 others whimpered and refused to go further. The 6th sat in the snow and stared into the trees as if seeing something no one else could. Their handlers looked at each other. Their trained not to spook one muttered, "Something's wrong." So they reset, tried again. Same result. Dead zone, as if the boy had vanished not just from space, but time. The villagers came next, old men in snowshoes. Teenagers with bright coats and borrowed walkie-talkies. Mothers who couldn't bear the thought of any child out there alone. They searched in silence mostly, only the sound of shovels and breath. The sun rose and fell behind clouds. Time smeared. Hours passed like weeks. And then at 2:17 p.m. a scream. It wasn't Caleb. It was his mother. They found her a quarter mile from the shed alone. Knees buried in the snow, shoulders shaking like leaves in wind. In her hands, crumpled, soaked, was the same drawing, folded, unfolded, clenched like a prayer. She refused to let go. "He's here," she sobbed. "I can feel it. I can feel him." The sheriff knelt. "We're doing everything." "Look at the eyes," she interrupted, thrusting the paper into his face. "No dog looks like that." "That's not just an animal." Her voice cracked. "He's not alone." From the hill above, her husband stood watching, hands buried deep in his coat pockets, face unreadable. He had no more tears left. Just cold and guilt. Behind them, the wind began to pick up again, as if the storm too was listening. By nightfall, they had searched 5 square miles. The helicopters couldn't fly. Visibility dropped again. The maps were marked with X's and timestamps. Still nothing. Then came the speculation. He might have fallen through ice. There are caves up that ridge. Wolves sometimes range this far south. "Shut up," someone snapped. "Just shut the hell up." They were all thinking it. No food. No heat. A 7-year-old alone in the wilderness, 2 nights gone, and temperatures below -20. The window for survival was closing. But still they searched. Still they called his name. The searchlight stretched into the trees, casting long, crooked shadows that moved like ghosts. And in those shadows, hope began to fracture. Some refused to go home. They built a fire line, rotated shifts, drank bad coffee, stared into the dark like it might blink back. His mother refused to rest. She walked the line between search teams, always clutching the drawing, always whispering his name like it was a spell she was afraid would fade. At 3:32 a.m. she stopped walking, not because she gave up, but because she couldn't feel her legs. They carried her back to the cabin. She refused the blanket, refused the tea, only sat holding the paper, whispering. He's warm, he's not afraid, he's with something. Someone laughed bitterly in the corner. Lady, if he was with something, it's a damn miracle he's still alive. She looked up slowly, then smiled, a smile that chilled the room. He is. Night fell fast and hard in the mountains. The kind of darkness that wasn't just absence of light. It was a presence in itself. Heavy, watching, as if the world had exhaled and forgotten to breathe in again. Somewhere deep in that darkness, Caleb lay curled between the roots of a fir tree. Snow had drifted over him in a soft, deceptive blanket. His small body didn't tremble. His eyes were open, glassy, blank, but not afraid. His lips were pale, his fingers stiff. His coat had torn along one sleeve, revealing skin already chapped and raw. And yet he was alive. He didn't cry, he didn't call out. He just listened, not to the wind, not to the trees, but to the slow, deep rhythm of breathing beside him. Something warm, something alive, something large curled around his back, its body rising and falling with every breath like the tide against a sleeping shore. The fur against his cheek was coarse, but comforting. The sound, steady, almost ancient, was what anchored him in the dark. It was the only sound in the world that didn't hurt. Outside, the wind howled and threw frozen branches against the rocks, but it couldn't touch him here. Not where the creature lay, not where the golden eyes watched. Back at the cabin, no one slept. The rescue team had pulled back for the night. The forest had become a death trap. Snow, now knee-deep ice hardening along the ridgelines, temperatures plunging to -30. The medics called it suicidal to keep going. But inside the cabin, the boy's father paced like a man imprisoned. The fire hissed behind him, casting his shadow wide and warped across the log walls. He couldn't sit, couldn't eat, couldn't speak. He just walked, back and forth, a caged animal of a different kind. At 3:12 a.m., he sat down at the table and opened the old brown folder he hadn't touched in years. Medical records, assessments, a note from a specialist written in looping clinical cursive. Caleb exhibits characteristics consistent with level 2 autism spectrum disorder. Limited verbal output, elevated sensory sensitivity, strong pattern recognition. Recommend speech therapy and behavioral support services immediately. He'd read it once back then and closed it. Shut the folder like it was a diagnosis for someone else's child. Not his. Not the son he'd dreamed of teaching to fish, to build fires, to run like hell across open fields. But Caleb never wanted those things. He didn't want to be touched. Didn't look people in the eye. Didn't speak unless it was to animals, or crayons, or the moon. He hadn't handled it well. Back then, he'd done what his own father had taught him to do, build walls. So he worked more hours, spent longer nights at the mill, left the special care to his wife while he drank quiet guilt in silence and called it love. He told himself Caleb didn't notice, but deep down, he knew better. And now, God help him, there was no one left to lie to. He stood and walked to the window, staring out into the black. The snow was relentless, choking the world inch by inch. "Please," he whispered. But the dark gave no answer. At sunrise, they resumed the search. New volunteers came. Fresh blood, fresh hope. But as they moved deeper into the woods, the silence grew thicker. No footprints, no trail, no signs of shelter or struggle. Caleb had vanished so completely, it made people whisper when they thought they were alone. Maybe he never went into the woods. Maybe he was taken. They didn't say the other word. The one everyone feared most. Dead. But the silence said it for them. Still, the mother refused to let go. She walked with the drawing tucked into her coat fingers, always brushing the edge of the paper like a talisman. Every time someone said, if she said when we find him, when we bring him home. But on the third night, something broke. It wasn't dramatic, no sobbing, no collapse. She simply stood in the middle of a frozen clearing, face to the sky, and closed her eyes. And for the first time, she stopped whispering his name. She stopped calling, because in her heart something had shifted. Not absence, not death, but distance. Caleb was somewhere she couldn't go. The camera of the mind cut back to him again, nestled in Snowface, flushed now with a strange, impossible warmth. The creature hadn't left. It stayed with him, curled close, breathing steady, silent but not cold. In the dark, Caleb opened his eyes and blinked once. He looked up, and for the first time in days, he moved. Slowly, he lifted his hand and rested it against the fur beside him. The creature didn't stir, didn't flinch, and in that moment the boy smiled. It was a flicker, a crack of light in the heavy dark, but it meant something had survived, something human. The fourth morning arrived, like a wound torn open by daylight. The storm had begun to pull back, sluggish, exhausted from its own violence. But it had left behind a world that looked scraped clean of time. Every surface gleamed with the sharp sheen of ice. The trees sagged like mourners. Silence stretched across the forest, like a skin too thin to hold back what lay beneath. By now, the official search radius had doubled. But the truth unspoken and bitter was that belief had shrunk. Survival beyond 72 hours in these temperatures was statistically unlikely. That word again, unlikely. The numbers crept in when hope began to fade. They tried not to say it aloud, but it was there in the eyes of the men, in the tightening lips of the sheriffs, in the tension of the clipped radio chatter. Still they searched. Still they moved into the forest with GPS beacons blinking on their shoulders, dragging sleds of emergency gear, stepping over terrain they'd already combed twice, 3 times, refusing to admit what they all feared. But something was different this morning. It started with a call-in from Unit 4. 2 veteran volunteers, Simon and Laird, both ex-wildlife rangers experienced with tracking. They'd split from the main sweep just after sunrise to investigate the northern ridge above the basin. It was a jagged run of cliffs and old snowfields known as Fox Hollow, a place few bothered with. Too steep, too narrow, too damned cold to be worth the risk. But that morning from the overlook near the drop, Simon spotted something below irregularities in the powder. Not natural, not windblown, not human. Tracks. They made their way down carefully, carving footholds into the side of the basin. Ice cracked beneath their boots. The sky above was mercilessly blue, the kind that made your bones feel like glass. And then they saw them. The prints. Simon stopped cold. Jesus. They weren't fresh, not exactly. A layer of frost had settled on top, but not deep enough to mask their definition. They were wide, heavier than coyote or fox, and far too large for lynx or wolverine. Dog Laird offered, but it sounded like a question. Simon didn't answer immediately. He knelt by the nearest print, brushing the snow carefully aside with gloved fingers. The imprint was almost surgical in its clarity. 4 toe pads, 1 central, claw marks. Yes, canine, but too big and too deep. It's not domestic, he said finally. If it is a dog, it's a big one, at least 90 pounds. And it's moving through here alone. Laird glanced around the slope. The trail curved between boulders, snaked behind a rock outcropping, and he stopped. The trail ended, just like that, mid-stride. He walked forward, checked the surroundings. There were no diversions, no jumps, no backtrack, no scuffle, no blood, no sign the animal had fallen or been carried. It had just stopped. Simon frowned. That's not possible. Laird stepped in a slow circle, scanning for anything broken. Branches, fur scat, drag marks. Nothing. It's like it vanished. They radioed it in. Within the hour, a new squad was dispatched to join them. 6 men and a canine unit fresh from the western flank. The search refocused on that basin. At 11:42 a.m., one of the searchers, Amos Briggs, former Army, moved upwind from the group to check a narrow funnel of trees. He wasn't 20 feet in before he froze. He heard it. A bark. Not close, not far, but wrong. It didn't sound like a dog. Not exactly. It was too resonant, almost doubled, like a human voice had mimicked the shape of the sound. It echoed against the trees, unnaturally bouncing from angle to angle, as if the forest itself was unsure where it came from. He turned to the others. Did you hear that? They looked confused. I heard something. Coyote, maybe. But Amos shook his head. That wasn't a coyote. He stepped further in, the sound still caught in his ears like a splinter. The bark hadn't come once. It had come twice, layered, simultaneous, like two voices calling from the same throat. He checked his comms, nothing but static. Then another sound, deeper this time, not a growl, a breath, a low animal breath. He froze, reached for his flare. Behind him the trees rustled, but not with wind. And then silence again. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. When the rest of the unit arrived minutes later, Amos was still standing there. Eyes glassy, pulse thudding hard in his neck. "You okay?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, just think I heard something that didn't belong here." The team spread out. Simon returned to the tracks, still unsettled. He couldn't shake the strangeness. The way the trail had just ended, like a dream that cut off mid-image. He'd tracked predators through snow most of his adult life. But this was wrong. As the wind picked up, they set flares and marked the area for aerial drones. Even though no drone had been able to hold flight more than 5 minutes since the storm, they moved higher along the ridgeline and found more prints. But this time not in snow, in ice, fused into the top crust. Frozen over like fossils. Impossibly preserved. 6 in a perfect line. And then, nothing. No exit path, no disruption. Just a line of prints leading to a flat outcrop overlooking the canyon. Simon stared out over the ledge. Nothing below but wind and white. But he couldn't shake the feeling. Something had stood here, watched, waited, and then disappeared. Back at the base camp, the sheriff gathered the intel and narrowed his eyes. "We're not chasing a wild dog," he muttered. "We're chasing something else." One of the deputies snorted. "Don't start with that ghost crap again." But McCrae was already looking at the sketch. The one the mother had left beside her son's pillow. The eyes on that drawing didn't look like a dog's. They didn't look like anything he'd seen before. And in the pit of his stomach, something turned cold. He looked out at the woods, wind howling again through the canyons. "Whatever it is," he said, "it's not running from us." It happened just after dawn on the 4th day. The storm had weakened overnight, and a window of fragile calm opened between gusts of biting wind. The sun, dulled behind a shroud of fog, cast pale gold across the whitewashed ridges of Alberta's backcountry. Nothing sparkled. Everything bled light in quiet surrender. The world had been stripped of color, of sound, of everything but cold, and the unspoken prayer that still lingered in every breath of the searchers. They'd expanded the perimeter again, pushing into the terrain no one thought worth checking. Too steep, too remote, too damned far. But hope, like hunger, finds its edge in desperation. Troy Madsen wasn't a sheriff or a ranger or a trained rescuer. He was a farmer from Dunford, 62 years old, half deaf in one ear and running mostly on stubbornness. His wife had begged him not to come, said the roads were still dangerous, said it wasn't his place. But Troy had known loss. A long time ago, his niece had gone missing for 2 days and never came back. And in the years since, that silence had grown claws. So he came. Alone, he walked the northern cut of the glacial trench west of Fox Hollow, an area that hadn't been charted on the main grid. He didn't use GPS, didn't trust it. Just followed the wind, the slope, and some old instinct that whispered there. At 7:16 a.m., his boot slid on a patch of ice near a narrow crevice in the rock wall. It was nearly invisible, just a fracture in the cliff, half covered in drift. But something about it didn't feel right. The snow was disturbed, not blown, but pressed, flattened. He dropped to one knee. The gap was barely wide enough for a child to fit through, maybe 18 inches across. But it opened into a funnel like a natural stone cradle, jagged, shadowed, and there nestled in the center of the hollow, a shape. He didn't move, didn't breathe. At first he thought it was a bundle of discarded cloth, but then the shape moved. It twitched. A head lifted, and Troy saw a pair of eyes. Not human, amber, glowing. The dog. Dog, if that's what it was, lifted its head slowly, like it had known he was there the whole time. Its body was curved around something else, a smaller shape. Human. The boy, Caleb, curled up, his cheek pressed against thick fur, his body tucked into the hollow like it had been placed there by something with hands. His skin was pale, lips cracked, but his chest rose. Steady, breathing, alive. Troy didn't scream. He didn't call for help. He just knelt, tears freezing against his beard. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Oh my sweet God." Then the dog moved. It rose, graceful, fluid, larger than any husky he'd seen. Not bulky, lithe. with a coat that shimmered oddly between shades of silver and white, like it reflected what the sky couldn't decide. But it was the eyes that held him. Gold, not yellow, not brown. Gold like sunlight through whiskey, sharp and knowing. It looked at him, not like an animal, like something older, something watching him. Troy reached slowly for the radio at his belt, hand trembling. "Unit Delta, this is Madsen." His voice cracked. "I've found him. I've found the boy." The response was instant. Shouts, coordinates, teams scrambling. But Troy couldn't look away from the creature. It didn't growl, didn't run. It just stepped aside, letting the morning light hit Caleb's face for the first time in days. The boy stirred, eyes fluttered, and for the briefest second he smiled. Not at Troy, at the creature. And then the husky turned. No hesitation, no fear. It stepped through the gap in the rocks and walked into the snowdrift. One step, two, gone. By the time the others arrived 20 minutes later, it had vanished. Only its prints remained, already being filled by fresh snow. Caleb was lifted carefully from the hollow wrapped in thermals and checked by medics on site. His vitals somehow were stable. Core body temperature was 98.1 degrees. Not hypothermic, no frostbite, no sign of starvation. He was dehydrated, yes. Exhausted, but not in distress. His skin was warm to the touch. "It's not possible," one medic whispered. "He should be." "Don't say it," the sheriff interrupted. The mother arrived soon after. She collapsed beside him, arms around her son, sobbing without words. Caleb didn't speak, but his fingers never let go of the tuft of fur clutched in his coat. White, coarse, and threaded through with a single golden strand. They carried him back down the mountain in absolute silence. No cheers, no noise, just the crunch of boots in snow and the soft hiss of breath clouds in the cold. The medic closest to him kept glancing down at the vitals display on the portable scanner, as if it might flicker and tell a different story. It didn't. 98.1 degrees. Breathing steady, pulse slow but strong, not even a cough. They loaded Caleb into the back of the snow vehicle with the precision of those too afraid to believe what they were seeing. Not a scratch on him. No frostbite, no disorientation. Just quiet, alert, still holding the scrap of fur like it was stitched to his fingers. His mother rode with him, eyes locked on her son's face the entire way down the slope. She didn't speak. She didn't ask questions. She only whispered his name once, and when he blinked in response, that was enough. She pressed her forehead to his and closed her eyes. At the base station, a trauma team met them with heat blankets, drips emergency oxygen. They touched him, examined him, prodded him like they expected his skin to crack open and reveal something unnatural. But it didn't. It was just Caleb. Caleb who'd survived 4 days in a wilderness that killed grown men. Caleb whose body was warm, too warm. The lead physician, a man with 24 years in mountain rescue, stood back after the third scan and removed his gloves. "I don't have an explanation for this," he said. No one did. That night they returned to the cabin. Not the hospital. Not yet. The parents insisted. And Caleb didn't resist. He clutched the threadbare cloth nose pressed against it like it held the last trace of air he could breathe. It smelled of wild. It smelled of fur and frost and something he couldn't name. The cabin hadn't changed. The fire was still crackling. The drawings still pinned to the walls. The same smell of wood smoke and wool. But it felt smaller now. Quieter. Like it knew a miracle had walked through its door and wasn't sure whether to bow or hide. The boy didn't speak that night, or the next, or the one after that. He moved through the house like a shadow watching, listening, drawing. The sketchbook returned to his lap on the third morning. He opened it carefully, like it had aged in his absence. The first drawing was slow, deliberate, the outline of a snout. Then ears, then the eyes. He paused and reached for the golden crayon. No one said anything. He drew the eyes first this time. 2 orbs, almond-shaped, bright, watching. The rest followed fur-tail paws. He filled the page, and when he was done, he closed the book. But the next morning he opened it again and drew the same thing. Slightly different angle, same eyes, again and again. A new page, a new posture, but always the same creature, always the same stare, the same warmth. The dog, if it was a dog, never barked in the drawings. It never snarled. It never played fetch or ran through grass like a real animal would. It only watched. Calm, quiet, present. The father watched the drawings pile up. He didn't speak either, but every night he stayed up just a little longer at the table, his fingers brushing that one long golden hair Caleb had kept in a glass jar. He remembered the stories his grandfather used to tell, about animals that didn't belong to this world, creatures that came when the earth was at its coldest, its cruelest, bringing warmth not as fire, but as company. He'd always dismissed those tales. Now he wasn't so sure. On the 5th day, the news broke. 7-year-old boy survives 4 days in Alberta snowstorm, the headline read. Rescue team baffled by miraculous condition. But they didn't know about the drawings. They didn't know about the creature. And no one, not one single camera, ever caught the tracks that had led to the crevice. By then they'd all been buried again. Erased, except in the boy's hands. He kept drawing, as if memory needed to be carved again and again so it wouldn't vanish. The dog's gaze never changed, and in it something lingered. Something that made you wonder who saved who. The air in the cabin changed, not suddenly, not like a crack of thunder or the snap of breaking glass. It was subtler than that, like the weight of something invisible had settled into the corners of the room. A presence that didn't move or speak, but waited. Like it knew a reckoning was coming. The drawings were now scattered across every surface, dozens of them. The same creature again and again, with variations so slight they bordered on compulsive. Slight tilt of the head, ears lowered, then alert. One with snowflakes melting on its snout, another with a paw partially lifted as if in mid-step. But always the same eyes. Gold, steady, watching. The local police had started their follow-up inquiries. 3 officers, 2 weeks post-rescue, knocked on the cabin door with polite smiles and heavy boots. They came in from the wind shaking snow off their jackets, trying to look casual, but they were here for answers. Or at least closure. They asked the boy questions. What did he eat? Did he find shelter? Did he see people? Caleb didn't answer. He never did. The only thing he did was turn his head slightly and look at the folded paper in his lap. One of the drawings. A new one. The officers exchanged glances. We'd like to speak to you both, said the lead investigator, a tall, sharp-featured woman named Thompson. She had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too many unsolved things. They sat at the kitchen table. Coffee was poured. No one drank it. We canvassed every home in a 60-mile radius. Not a single report of a missing husky or similar large dog, Thompson said. The father nodded slowly. So maybe it was a stray. No tags, no microchip, no sightings, and no tracks we could follow. The snow covered everything before we could even try to trace it. He exhaled. Then maybe it was wild. There's a lot of land out there. Thompson didn't respond immediately. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded a copy of one of Caleb's sketches, which they had retrieved from his school counselor's files with permission. This doesn't look like a regular dog. His mother stiffened. We know, she said softly. Thompson hesitated. We're not saying your son imagined it, but we're trying to understand. The odds of a wild animal not only finding a child, but keeping him warm alive and safe for 4 days in sub-zero temperatures. She trailed off. His father spoke before the silence could grow too long. We don't know what it was, he said. But it saved him. Thompson looked down at the drawing again. Then she folded it once neatly and slid it back into her coat. We're closing the file, she said. There's no crime here. No missing animal. No evidence of foul play. But as she left, she paused at the door. Between you and me, she said, voice lower now, we've had a few calls. Folks asking strange questions. Locals talking. The mother leaned forward. What kind of questions? Thompson hesitated. Then, ever hear of the Mi'kmaq stories? Or the Cree legend spirit animals? Guardians. Some kind of protector that comes in the snow when someone's about to die. She didn't wait for an answer, just nodded once, stepped outside, and vanished into the storm. That night, the parents argued. It was the first time since Caleb had come home that voices had risen in the house. Not shouts, just sharp words, fast and heavy like stones being thrown through ice. It wasn't real, the father said. It was just a dog. He drew it before he ever saw it. He draws wolves and dogs all the time. No, look at the eyes. Look at the size. That thing wasn't just an animal. You saw it. He didn't answer. You looked into its eyes, she said. So did I. And you can lie to the police. You can lie to the neighbors. But don't lie to me. He slammed his hand against the table, palm flat. Not in rage. In helplessness. I am not going to raise my son to believe in fairy tales because I couldn't face the truth. "And what's the truth?" she asked. He looked at her. "The truth is we weren't there. He was alone. And whatever saved him, dog or demon or God, it wasn't us." She turned away, not out of anger, out of grief, because deep down, she had started to believe something impossible, not out of desperation, but out of gratitude. And that kind of belief didn't need facts. It needed faith. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, quietly, gently, like the sky was trying to cover the world in silence again. Inside, Caleb sat by the fire, drawing, again. But this time, there were two figures, not just the dog. This time, a boy stood beside it, small, still, watching. And for the first time in weeks, he drew a smile. It was a still morning when they returned, the kind of morning where the snow didn't fall, it hovered. Tiny crystals hung in the air like suspended breath, unmoving, untouched. Alberta's forest lay beneath it like a frozen memory, unchanged, unforgiving. But something in the silence had shifted. It had been 10 days since Caleb's rescue. The news crews had come and gone. The medical teams had withdrawn. There were no more headlines, no more flashing cameras. The world, always hungry for stories, had moved on. But the questions hadn't, not for them. So they came back, not with a search party, not with drones or police. This time they brought someone different. Dr. Vincent Choi, a wildlife ecologist from the University of Alberta, had spent the better part of 2 decades tracking large predators through the Rockies. Wolves, cougars, grizzlies. He didn't believe in miracles, and he certainly didn't believe in spirit animals. But he believed in data, and something about the boy's story about the complete absence of traceable tracks. The golden eyes, the impossible survival made him leave his campus and follow a family back into the woods on a bitter snow-packed morning. The boy led the way, not with words, with steps. He walked slowly, deliberately, with his sketchbook tucked under one arm and a drawing clutched in his mittened hand. His parents followed behind him, quiet, cautious. Dr. Choi kept pace beside them, eyes scanning the trees, the cliffs, the wind-blown drifts. They reached the base of the ridgeline by midday. Choi paused, looking up at the jagged crack in the stone that had become legend in only a few days. "This is where they found him?" he asked. The father nodded. "Exactly there," said the mother, pointing to the crevice. She didn't speak again. There was reverence in her voice, and fear. They climbed slowly. The path was half-remembered, buried again by fresh snowfall. But Caleb moved as if he could see through it, as if the snow wasn't there for him. He reached the mouth of the crevice first, then stopped. The hollow was empty. No paw prints, no scat, no scratch marks, no flattened bed of fur. Dr. Choi moved forward, carefully brushing snow from the stone. He crouched, pulled out a small pair of tweezers, and retrieved something nearly invisible to the naked eye, a strand of hair. Silver. He examined it under a hand lens. "Not wolf," he said quietly. "Too coarse, too straight. Could be husky, but the pigment is irregular. See this?" He turned it toward the light. It shimmered faintly, not just silver. There were hints of gold threaded through it. "What animal has hair like that?" the father asked. Dr. Choi didn't answer. He bagged the strand and stood. They searched the area for over an hour, found 3 more hairs. No blood, no droppings, no claw marks, and no prints. Not one. Fresh snow had fallen the night before, but the kind that records everything, rabbits, birds, the brush of falling pine cones. Yet here there was nothing. Not even the print of the boots they'd just made a few minutes before. They were disappearing behind them, as if the snow wanted it that way, as if it was covering something. Choi grew visibly frustrated. "There should be more," he muttered. "There's always more. Animals leave trails, always." He looked around again, then at Caleb. The boy was kneeling in the exact spot where he'd been found, where the husky had curled around him like a guardian carved from light and snow. He reached into his sketchbook, removed the newest drawing, and set it gently on the ground in front of him. The creature, golden eyes watching the forest. Only this time Caleb had drawn the background in detail, the ridgeline, the crack, the snow, and in the sky stars. Even though he'd been rescued in daylight, he had drawn night. Caleb stood. He didn't say a word, but he looked upward, straight to the sky, not like a boy praying, like someone saying thank you. His mother stepped forward, her hand lightly brushing his back. Tears welled in her eyes. Not because she finally believed, because she no longer needed to question it. Behind them, Dr. Choi stood silent. He opened his mouth once to speak, then closed it. The wind picked up. A low hum passed through the trees, but it wasn't cold. For the first time all season, It felt warm. The snow had stopped falling, but the silence it left behind still held its shape. It moved through the valley like a memory no one could name, curling between branches, pressing down against the cabin roof, whispering through the frost-bitten wind chimes that had not made a sound in days. Winter in Alberta wasn't just a season, it was a presence. And for those who'd lived long enough, it was a language. It was a week after the family had returned from the crevice when the old man came knocking. He didn't arrive in a truck. He didn't ride with the wildlife teams or the press. He came on foot, quiet, deliberate, bundled in a deerskin coat older than Caleb's parents put together. His name was Noah Running Cloud, a Cree elder whose stories were as old as the mountains themselves. Noah didn't ask to come in. He was invited. Caleb watched him from the corner, sketchbook in hand. He didn't speak, but his eyes didn't leave the man. Noah nodded once at the boy, then turned to the parents. "I heard about your son," he said. His voice was weathered bark, each syllable shaped by firewood and time. "And I heard what found him." They didn't answer. He took a seat by the fire, unwrapped a woolen scarf from his throat, and set a small pouch on the table. From it he removed something pale and delicate, a small carving maybe 5 inches long. A dog, or something like a dog. Its head was lifted, its tail curled in mid-run. Its eyes had been painted carefully, lovingly with ochre. "Gold. This," he said, "is a story we've carried for longer than anyone in this country has kept written records. Some call it myth. But in our way, truth doesn't need proof. It only needs memory." He placed the carving on the hearth. "We call it Atim Askiu, the snow dog, spirit of the deep forest. It appears when a child is truly lost, not just in body, but in soul, and only to those whose hearts are still open to the language of the wild, to those not yet drowned by noise." The mother sat forward. "You mean this has happened before?" He nodded. "Not often. Maybe once every few generations. A child wanders too far. The world forgets them. But the snow doesn't. The dog finds them. Not to return them, but to remember them." The father's voice was strained. "So you believe this was a ghost? A spirit?" Noah looked at him gently. "I believe nature has guardians. Not always in ways we understand, but always when we need them most." He turned back to Caleb. "You saw him, didn't you?" Caleb didn't answer, but he opened the sketchbook and showed the man the newest page. The dog, sitting beside a frozen lake, its head turned, watching something beyond the page. Noah smiled. "Yes, that's him." The mother blinked. "You've seen this spirit?" "No," Noah said. "But my grandfather did, and his great-grandmother before him. They say the dog walks between this world and the next. It's not tame. It's not wild. It's what exists when everything else fails. When the last fire goes out. When the last name is forgotten. The dog remembers." There was silence, but not discomfort, not fear, just stillness. Outside, snow creaked on the porch steps as a gust of wind shifted the world once more. Then Noah spoke again. "But you must understand, these things do not come freely. They are not summoned. They do not rescue." "Then why did it help Caleb?" the father asked. Noah's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with gravity. "Because your son still listens. Because the world has not drowned his senses. Because perhaps he was never truly separate from it." He leaned forward. "And because love, real love, the kind that sees without words, has its own frequency. One even the wind remembers." He stood gently rewrapping the scarf around his neck. Then he placed the carving in Caleb's hands. "This belongs to you now." Caleb didn't look up. He simply held it, like he had been waiting. When the door closed behind Noah, no one spoke for a long time, not even the wind. That night, something changed. Not in the forest. In the home, the television stayed off. Phones were left face down. The father didn't pour whiskey into the coffee mug with the worn handle. Instead, he lit the fire himself. Without speaking, he placed one of Caleb's drawings, just one above the mantel, not as decoration, as acknowledgement. They didn't talk about what they now believed. They didn't have to, but they stopped asking Caleb to be someone else. They stopped measuring his worth by words. They learned his language. The next morning, the mother took him out onto the porch and pointed to a line of bird tracks in the snow. "Look," she said, "tell me what they're saying." And Caleb drew them, then added a shadow behind them. Not a predator, a companion. From that day on, they lived differently. Slower, softer. They learned to follow the quiet. And in that quiet, they found Caleb. And in him they found something more. A reminder that the world, when it wants to be kind, sends its messengers not in thunder, but in golden eyes. There is a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with applause or milestones or breakthroughs that can be charted on a graph. It comes slowly like the thawing of snow around a buried root. Quiet, steady, almost imperceptible. Caleb began to return not in words, but in color. The drawings changed first. He no longer repeated the golden-eyed dog over and over. Now the creature appeared beside other animals, wolves, deer, foxes, owls, sometimes walking with them, sometimes protecting them, sometimes simply watching from a hillside, while a family of rabbits curled together beneath the snow. Each page told a story, not one he could explain, but one that made sense to him and to others. It was his new way of speaking, and the world began to listen. It started with Ms. Henley. She wasn't a therapist or a doctor. She was an art teacher sent to Caleb's rural school part-time as part of a grant to integrate alternative education into under-resourced districts. She'd seen children who screamed, who shut down, who disappeared into themselves. But not like Caleb. He didn't scream, he didn't resist. He just observed and drew. The first time she saw his sketchbook, she stayed behind after school just to flip through every page. There was a vocabulary in the lines, a structure. Emotion stitched into every shape, curved lines for comfort, sharp ones for fear, dense shading when he didn't want something seen. When she asked him gently to draw how he felt that day, he handed her a picture of a crow with half of its wings in light, the other in shadow. She didn't ask questions, she just nodded. Over the weeks, she offered him more pastels, charcoal, even watercolor. He touched each medium like it might dissolve in his hands. But eventually, he began to experiment. He painted the Husky again, but now surrounded by wildflowers. He drew a forest on fire, and beside it a single animal with golden eyes breathing stars into the sky. Each drawing was a conversation, and Caleb, still without words, was beginning to speak. The parents saw it. It was in the way he looked at them when he finished a piece, like he was waiting to be heard. And for the first time, they knew how to respond. They didn't ask what it meant. They didn't translate. They just received it. And for a boy whose world had once been locked behind silence, that was everything. Then the letters started arriving. It began as a story passed from one local paper to another. Boy survives blizzard with help of mysterious Husky. But it spread. By the time it reached international newswires, it had been transformed into something else entirely, a fable. A modern-day legend of survival and trust between child and animal. Some called it divine. Others called it folklore. But almost everyone agreed there was something about the story that couldn't be explained by science alone. And people wanted to do something. That's when the letter from the Wildlife Humanity Trust arrived. It was brief, respectful, but direct. They wanted to honor the bond between Caleb and the creature that saved him, not just as a tale of survival, but as a symbol of the unspoken link between nature and innocence. They proposed a sculpture, a bronze Husky, life-sized, to be placed near the trailhead closest to where Caleb had been found. The parents were hesitant at first. It felt strange turning something so deeply personal into something public. But it wasn't about them. It was about what the story had become, a signal fire for other families, other children who walked through the world quietly, and maybe one day a reminder to someone who needed to believe in kindness again. Caleb never said yes. He didn't need to. He drew the statue. Before the design was even submitted, he had already drawn it, exactly as it would be sculpted. Husky's sitting eyes raised slightly to the wind, with a boy-shaped shadow cast beside it in soft pencil. The artists followed his blueprint, and when the sculpture was unveiled, that spring snow still clinging to the edges of the path, Caleb stood beside it in silence. Hundreds attended, reporters, hikers, artists, parents holding children close. But Caleb didn't see them. He saw only the statue. He stepped forward, traced a finger along the bronze fur, and then slowly pressed his drawing into the base. No one spoke. No one needed to, because some things don't require explanation. They only require memory. It had been years since the storm. The snow still came each winter thick and breathless, blanketing the Alberta mountains with the same old silence. But time had softened its edges. The tragedy, once sharp as frostbite, had become something else. Not forgotten, not erased, just folded into the rhythm of life. In a quiet house, tucked near the edge of a small town, an old man sat by the fire, with a leather-bound journal on his lap. The pages were worn, the ink faded in places. Some entries had been smeared by weather, others by tears. But the handwriting remained firm, steady as memory. A boy sat cross-legged on the floor in front of him, maybe 9 years old. His face bore the unmistakable shape of someone descended from the mountain, Caleb's son. He looked like his father had at that age, quiet, intense, observant. But he smiled more. He laughed. He asked questions. Tonight he'd asked a very specific one. "Is it true?" The old man smiled without showing teeth. "Which part?" "The dog, the one in the snow, the one with the yellow eyes." The grandfather didn't answer right away. He ran his fingers along the edge of the page and let the silence stretch. Then finally he began to read. "Day 2, he said, a loud voice, gravel thick. They still hadn't found him. The snow had buried the tracks. The dogs were spooked. The wind sounded like it was screaming. The boy listened with wide eyes. And on day 4, the old man continued. They found him. Tucked into a rock bed, safe. Warm. Wrapped in something they couldn't explain. He looked up, and when they tried to find the animal that saved him, it was gone. No tracks, no trace. Only golden hairs in the snow. The boy whispered, "Was it real?" The old man closed the journal slowly. "I was there," he said. "I saw the look in his eyes when they brought him back. He wasn't afraid, not even cold. And for the rest of his life, your father drew that creature. Always the same way. Always the same eyes." He leaned forward. "And you know what he said once?" The boy shook his head. "He said some friends don't need to stay forever, just long enough to bring you home." Outside, the snow had begun to fall again. Not a storm, just the first flakes of winter whispering back into the valley like an old song returning. The family no longer lived in the mountains full time. Years ago, they had moved into the valley town, small, close-knit, wrapped in pines and frost. They ran a wildlife rescue clinic from a renovated barn just off the main road. The mother helped coordinate volunteers. The father tracked injured animals in the backcountry. And Caleb, now an adult, was a conservation artist whose work had been exhibited from Toronto to Tokyo. But every year when the first snow fell, they gathered in the town square and told the story. Not from a stage, from memory. Locals called it the Winter Friend. Children huddled close, wide-eyed, as elders spoke of a boy who vanished during a storm and the creature who found him in the dark. They spoke of the husky with golden eyes. They spoke of silence and survival, of the bond between innocence and instinct. And always when the tale ended, they pointed to the statue that stood just beyond the fire circle, the bronze figure of the doghead lifted forever, listening to something only the wild could understand. It had become a landmark, a ritual, a promise that some stories don't need to be proven to be true. Back inside the house, the fire had burned low. The boy sat closer to the hearth, now gaze lost in the shadows dancing on the wall. "Do you think it would come back?" he asked. The grandfather leaned back in his chair. "No," he said. "I think it never left." And somewhere in the hush between falling flakes, something watched, something remembered. The morning snow fell without sound, not the harsh biting wind of the storm long ago. This snow was softer, slower. It moved like memory across the frozen valley, brushing the rooftops of the town, curling around pine branches, settling gently on the bronze statue in the square. Winter had returned. But this time it brought with it peace, not fear. Caleb stepped onto the white path behind the cabin, a leash in one hand, the other tucked in his coat pocket. He was older now, no longer the fragile boy lost in the storm, but not yet a man either. There was quiet strength in his posture, the kind carved by silence, shaped by time. Beside him, a husky pup trotted eagerly across the snow, its paws barely making a sound. Its fur was a mix of pale gray and white, with a streak of silver down its spine, like a whisper of something ancient. The dog sniffed the air, tongue out, tail wagging, but occasionally it paused, stared, watched the tree line, like it knew something the world had forgotten. They walked together without speaking. The trees on either side arched like old memories, their branches stretched like arms frozen mid-embrace. The trail was empty, but it didn't feel lonely. At a bend near the ridge, Caleb stopped. The wind carried a soft sigh over the hills. He turned his gaze toward the mountains. It had been years since he'd last come this far alone. Not since the day he was found. The crevice was miles away, now hidden behind layers of snow and time, but the weight of it never left. It didn't need to be seen to be remembered. The pup came to his side, nose twitching. Then something flickered, a shift in the morning light, a reflection in the dog's eyes. Caleb knelt beside it, brushing snow from its muzzle. The pup looked up, and there it was, the gold, not in the sun, in its eyes. Not bright yellow like ordinary pups, not amber, but golden, deep, ancient, burning like candlelight inside a storm. His breath caught. The dog blinked once, calm, patient, like it was waiting for him to understand. And Caleb did, not with words, with something deeper. Recognition, connection, not a memory, not a dream, a return. He didn't speak, didn't cry. He simply nodded as if to say, "I remember you." And the pup nudged his hand gently. Together they stood. The snow around them deepened. The trees blurred into shadow. In the distance, the mountains stood in perfect stillness, vast and watching. The camera pulled back, higher, wider. Caleb and the dog. Tiny now stood at the center of a vast white canvas, alone yet completely whole. No sound but the wind. No path but their own. The landscape was quiet, but something was there. Something watching, something eternal. And on the screen, just before the final fade to white words appeared. There are things that connect people and nature beyond language, things only children and animals ever truly feel. Fade out. Snow continues to fall. The world holds its breath, and the golden eyes somewhere in the distance remain open.